Look at the screen, this is the Soviet Union. At the height of its power, this country shook the very foundations of the global geopolitical map, disrupting the world order long dominated by Western imperialism for over a century. Yet, just a few decades before, it had been a backward agricultural nation, lagging far behind other great powers. But everything changed with the arrival of one man, the great leader Joseph Stalin. Let us turn back time to the end of 1878, in a small town in eastern Georgia. A boy named Iosif Vissarionis Dzhugashvili, later known to the world as Joseph Stalin, was born. Like many other children living under the Tsarist regime, his childhood was far from peaceful. Born into a middle-class family with an alcoholic father who often beat his wife and children, the future leader's early years were marked by conflict, arguments, and domestic violence. This came to an end in 1883, when his mother took her 5-year-old son and left home. For nearly a decade after that, he and his mother wandered from place to place, struggling to make a living. And it was during this time that Joseph began to perceive the deep-rooted corruption of Russian society under the autocratic monarchy. Under the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, the economy of the White Birch Land, Russia, was virtually destroyed. Domestic industrial productivity stagnated, while unemployment reached alarming levels, leaving many unable to survive and forcing them into desperate lives on the streets. To put it in perspective, the number of beggars in major cities like Moscow at the time outnumbered TikTokers in America today. Beyond hunger, Russia at that time could be seen as a prison of nations, where not only ethnic minorities but also ethnic Russians were subjected to forced labor. Society was filled with tension and contradictions between the suffering masses and the elites living in luxury in the Winter Palace. All of this left a powerful impression on the young Joseph, forming the earliest ideological foundations of the future leader. In August 1894, Iosif, then 15 years old, was admitted to the Tiflis Theological Seminary thanks to the help of a family acquaintance who was a priest. It was here, driven by his deep love for literature, that he joined an underground book club in the school. Through this group, the future leader of the Red Empire was introduced to forbidden literature that condemned the rotten regime he and millions of Russians had endured. More importantly, it was here that he discovered the guiding light of his life, communism. Through Karl Marx's Das Kapital, he came to understand the dark nature of capitalism, a system that had driven voiceless people like him and his mother into lives of exploitation and poverty. Later, when he came to power, he would comment on this ideology with chilling clarity. "When we hang the capitalists, they will sell us the rope we use." From that point on, the future leader placed unwavering belief in Marxism, a doctrine he saw as the only path to liberate the suffering people from the autocratic rule of the Tsar. However, unlike his peers, Iosif understood that simply sitting still would change nothing in society, and therefore he had to act. Through his connections with local laborers, the future leader gained access to secret worker study circles and began taking his first steps into the political world. In 1899, Iosif was expelled from the seminary due to his revolutionary activities. However, according to his mother, the real reason was his declining health. After leaving school, he found a clerical job at a meteorological observatory in Tbilisi. But the monotonous paperwork failed to hold his interest for long. Just a year later, he returned to underground political work, actively inciting protests and strikes across major industrial areas in the Caucasus region. By May 1901, on the occasion of International Workers' Day, Iosif organized a demonstration with over 3,000 participants, including laborers and left-leaning activists, making it one of the most significant political events of that year. However, contrary to his expectations, the demonstration did not proceed peacefully. It ended in violence when the crowd clashed with Tsarist troops. The result: dozens were arrested or injured. This incident shocked many of his comrades, most of whom had intended only a peaceful protest. Doubts began to arise about Iosif's ambitions and the extent of his ruthlessness. The Mensheviks were led by Julius Martov, while the Bolsheviks were headed by Vladimir Lenin. In 1903, Stalin chose to side with the Bolsheviks and became a student of Lenin. After his release from exile, he participated in several party policy planning meetings held in Tammerfors, Stockholm, and London. However, he did not leave much of an impression during these conferences. Nonetheless, the future leader came to a key realization. What the party needed most at that moment was money to fund its operations. Guided by the motto, "As long as there are no police around, anything is legal," Stalin and his Bolshevik comrades carried out a series of illegal activities to raise funds for the party. On June 25, 1907, with the help of several fellow Bolsheviks, he orchestrated a daring bank robbery in Tbilisi, securing a large sum of money to finance future revolutionary efforts. In early 1912, the first major turning point in ISF's political career emerged. The Bolsheviks held elections for the Central Committee of the party, and ISF, thanks to his behind-the-scenes contributions, was finally granted a seat by Lenin and his comrades. Just 1 month after assuming this new role, he returned to Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, and became an editor for the newspaper Pravda, which means truth. However, his joy was short-lived. In May 1912, he was once again arrested by the Russian imperial authorities and sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia. Yet, the future leader knew that his revolutionary work was too important to be abandoned, especially as the momentum for revolution was growing. Therefore, after serving just 4 months, he escaped from exile and returned to Petrograd to resume his editorial work at Pravda. It was during this time that he adopted the name Stalin, derived from the Russian word stal, meaning steel, and thus the nickname the Man of Steel of the Red Empire was born. Yet misfortune did not spare him. Just 6 months after his escape, ISF was captured once again. And unlike previous times, Lady Luck had turned her back on him. He was sentenced to 4 full years of detention. On July 28, 1914, World War I began. Like most other nations on the European continent, Imperial Russia, under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, entered the war. However, as previously noted, Russia's military capabilities were vastly inferior to those of other European powers. It became commonplace for 2 or 3 soldiers to share a single rifle, and the only outcome was devastating defeat. Despite this, the autocratic regime had no intention of withdrawing, continuing to force citizens and even prisoners, including Stalin, into fighting a war they had never asked for. This situation pushed the Russian people's patience to the limit, as they watched those in power remain sheltered within the Winter Palace. Finally, on March 16, 1917, March 3rd on the old Russian calendar, the February Revolution broke out and succeeded, overthrowing the Tsarist autocracy. However, Russia soon found itself in a state of dual power, with 2 governments coexisting, the Provisional Bourgeois Democratic Government and the Soviets of Workers, Soldiers, and Peasants' Deputies. But, as the old saying goes, 2 tigers cannot share one mountain. The conflict could only end with the fall of one side. And so, the inevitable happened. On October 25, 1917, Old Russian calendar, November 7th on the modern calendar, the Great October Revolution triumphed. From that moment on, a socialist government ruling 1/9 of the Earth's surface was born. However, surrounded by capitalist imperialist nations and remnants of the old regime still lingering within a country devastated by war, the young Soviet state was forced into a brutal civil war to defend its survival. In this context, Stalin, having been granted amnesty months earlier, recognized an opportunity to gradually consolidate his power within the party. He began by resigning from his editorial position at Pravda and was appointed as People's Commissar for Nationalities. From there, he became one of the 4 pillars of the new government alongside Lenin, Trotsky, and Sverdlov. Moreover, Stalin firmly supported Lenin's decision to establish a secret police force, the Cheka, tasked with tracking down and eliminating individuals deemed enemies of the Soviet state. From 1918 to 1919, Stalin took part in commanding the Red Army during the Russian Civil War and was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, despite facing widespread criticism. The reason was his use of human wave tactics, which led to unnecessary mass casualties. Additionally, he carried out purges without trial, all in the name of the revolution. By 1921, after the Civil War had ended, yet another period of turmoil swept through the Soviet state. The policy of grain requisitioning to support the war effort was no longer viable, especially as most Soviet citizens lacked enough food to feed themselves and their families. As a result, strikes, protests, and even armed uprisings erupted throughout the country. Facing this dire situation, Lenin, head of the Communist Party at the time, recognized the need for a shift in economic policy. This led to the introduction of the new economic policy, NEP. The NEP significantly improved living standards, but it also sparked deep internal conflict. Martov, the second most powerful figure in the government, proposed abolishing trade unions, a move that Lenin strongly opposed. From this point forward, two clear factions began to emerge within the Communist Party. One aligned with Lenin, with Stalin as a prominent figure, and the other supporting Trotsky. However, even Lenin himself began to grow suspicious of his once loyal protégé. Stalin had expressed a desire to absorb independent republics such as Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus region into the Russian Soviet state, raising concerns about his centralizing ambitions. Stalin's ambition to build a strong socialist federal state was initially supported by Lenin. However, Lenin later warned that forcibly merging different nations against their will would lead Russia back into imperialism, the very system the revolution had just overthrown. According to Lenin, the survival of the Soviet regime was tied to the success of the global proletarian revolution, especially in colonial and semi-colonial countries. To make that happen, the right of nations to self-determination had to be fully respected. He proposed the creation of a union of Soviet republics of Europe and Asia, reflecting a desire to expand revolutionary influence across both continents, where all nationalities would have equal voices. Stalin, however, feared that this would encourage non-Russian nations to seek independence, thus jeopardizing his dream of a powerful centralized state. This ideological divide between the two leaders became increasingly intense. Lenin accused Stalin of harboring great Russian chauvinism, while Stalin retaliated by accusing Lenin of promoting bourgeois national liberalism. At the time, Lenin still held overwhelming power, forcing Stalin to compromise. He agreed to the formation of a new country, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. From that moment on, a force that would haunt the Western world for the second half of the 20th century was officially born. However, Lenin was not satisfied. What he truly wanted was for Stalin to be stripped of power entirely. But that became increasingly unlikely when, in April 1922, Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that would later allow him to control the entire party apparatus. In his political testament, Lenin criticized Stalin for his authoritarianism and rude behavior, especially toward Lenin's wife. He also recommended Stalin be removed from the post of General Secretary, arguing that he lacked the necessary qualities to be trusted with so much power. Additionally, Lenin had warned that the tense relationship between Stalin and Trotsky posed the greatest threat to unity within the party's Central Committee. Although the authenticity of Lenin's political testament was later questioned, Stalin himself never challenged it publicly. In fact, the topic became taboo during his rule. But, as with all things, death is inevitable for any human. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin passed away. Since he had not named a successor before his death, it triggered a fierce power struggle within the Soviet Communist Party. The individual considered most likely to succeed Lenin was Leon Trotsky, who held major influence within both the Politburo and the Red Army, and was Stalin's fiercest political rival. However, fortune favored General Secretary Stalin when, shortly after Lenin's death, Trotsky unintentionally damaged his own standing by publishing Lessons of October, a book summarizing the events of the October Revolution. This publication offended many senior officials in the party, providing Stalin with the perfect opportunity to attack his top adversary. Trotsky was quickly accused of revisionism, holding opposing ideologies, and even acting against the Communist Party. Within a short time, Trotsky's political credibility collapsed, both within the party and among the Soviet public, forcing him to resign from his posts as People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs and chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council. Seizing the moment, Stalin, along with Comintern chairman Grigory Zinoviev and Premier Lev Kamenev, formed a power alliance to oust Trotsky, leaving him with only two choices: go into exile or stay and face Stalin's iron fist. Understanding the nature of the Georgian leader, Trotsky chose exile, thereby ending his political career for good. Now that Stalin held full power in his hands, his ambition to build a Red Empire began to unfold. From 1928 to 1941, he launched 3 consecutive 5-year plans, transforming the Soviet Union from a poor, backward country ravaged by war and feudalism into a powerful industrial giant, even surpassing the production capabilities of many European imperial powers at the time. However, power is a double-edged sword. It can help a man achieve miracles, but it can also stain his hands with blood. And Stalin was one of the most striking examples of that. From autumn 1936 to the end of 1938, a wave of executions, purges, and political repression swept across the Soviet Union. Today, this brutal episode is remembered as the Great Purge. Government officials, Red Army commanders, insurgents, gangsters, and even ordinary citizens, anyone suspected of harboring counter-revolutionary or anti-Soviet sentiments, became targets of Stalin's mass purge. For most of them, death was the final outcome. According to declassified Soviet records, between 1937 and 1938, the NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, arrested more than 1.5 million people, of which nearly 700,000 were executed, averaging around 1,000 executions per day. Other international estimates suggest that the death toll may have reached between 900,000 and 1.2 million people. Even former allies and key figures of the regime, if seen as a threat to Stalin's grip on power, were not spared. Notably, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, 2 members of the former ruling triumvirate, also fell victim to the purge. That said, the Soviet Union emerged from the Great Purge stronger than ever, as incompetent officials were either dead or imprisoned in the infamous Gulag labor camps, leaving behind a more obedient, streamlined bureaucracy under Stalin's absolute rule. And yet, before one storm had passed, another had already arrived. At this time, a figure emerged in Germany whom the world would forever remember as the mortal enemy of the Soviet leader, Adolf Hitler. Although the 2 powers cooperated on several occasions, most notably in 1939 with their infamous handshake to divide Poland, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, both leaders understood that war between them was inevitable. And so, in late June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union was forced to join the Allied powers to defend itself, a move that effectively marked the end of the short-lived golden age of the Third Reich. As the Red Army crushed Nazi forces across Eastern Europe, Stalin seized the opportunity to expand Soviet influence in the region, paving the way for the emergence of numerous communist states, and ultimately, laying the foundation for the future socialist bloc. However, Stalin was well aware that the ideological divide between him and the Western Allies was vast, and that it was only a matter of time before the 2 sides turned their weapons on each other. Indeed, just a few years after the end of World War II, humanity found itself plunged into a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. Faced with a nation devastated by war and a primary enemy, the United States, now possessing nuclear weapons capable of destroying the world, Stalin once again launched a series of 5-year plans, successfully restoring Soviet industry and agriculture to pre-war levels. Then, in 1949, the world was stunned when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, effectively ending America's monopoly on nuclear power and shattering Washington's ambition to stay 1,000 years ahead of the rest of the world. On March 5, 1953, the great leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, passed away. Looking back on his life, no one can deny that he was a dictator. However, it is equally undeniable that he single-handedly transformed the Soviet Union from a backward agrarian nation into a mighty empire. As British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once remarked, when Stalin took over, the Soviet Union was a country with a wooden plow. When he died, it had the atomic bomb.